Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia, during a time when America was recovering from World War I. He grew up in a modest household with his parents, William and Bertha Doss, and his siblings. His father was a carpenter, and his mother was a devoted Seventh-day Adventist who instilled in Desmond a deep religious faith that would define his entire life. The event that shaped Desmond's beliefs about violence occurred when he was a young boy. His father, who had served in World War I and suffered from what we would now recognize as PTSD, struggled with alcoholism. One night, during a violent argument between his parents, his father pulled a gun on his uncle. Young Desmond watched in horror as his mother grabbed the weapon and handed it to Desmond, telling him to run and hide it. Desmond ran through the dark streets of Lynchburg clutching the gun, terrified that his father might kill someone or be killed himself. That night left an indelible mark on him. He made a vow to God that he would never take a human life, no matter the circumstances. In the Doss household, there hung a framed poster depicting the Ten Commandments. Young Desmond was particularly drawn to the sixth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." Below the text was an illustration of Cain standing over Abel's body after committing the first murder. Desmond would stare at that image, and it reinforced his conviction that taking human life was fundamentally wrong. His Seventh-day Adventist faith taught that the Sabbath should be kept holy from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset, that the body was a temple and should not be defiled with alcohol or tobacco, and that life was sacred. These beliefs weren't just Sunday school lessons for Desmond, they were the foundation of his identity. A nation at war. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and America entered World War II. Young men across the country rushed to enlist, motivated by patriotism and outrage. Desmond Doss felt that same patriotic call. He believed deeply in America and its freedoms, and he wanted to serve his country, but he faced a profound dilemma. How could he serve in the military while maintaining his religious conviction against killing? Doss found his answer in the role of combat medic. He could serve his country, help his fellow soldiers, and save lives rather than take them. In April 1942, at age 23, he enlisted in the Army, specifically requesting assignment as a medic. He also requested to be classified as a conscientious objector, but with a crucial distinction. He was willing to serve in combat, just not to carry a weapon. This decision would make him one of the most controversial soldiers in American military history. Boot Camp Hell. When Desmond Doss arrived at Fort Jackson, South Carolina for basic training, he immediately became a target. His fellow soldiers viewed him as a coward, a religious fanatic, and a liability. Here was a man who refused to touch a rifle, wouldn't train on Saturdays because of his Sabbath observance, and claimed he was going into combat without any way to defend himself or his fellow soldiers. The harassment was relentless and brutal. Soldiers in his barracks beat him up. They threw boots at him while he prayed beside his bunk at night. They mocked him constantly, calling him a coward and worse. His sergeants and officers weren't much better. They saw him as a troublemaker who was disrupting unit cohesion and setting a bad example. One sergeant told him directly, "You're going to get us all killed. You won't even be able to defend yourself, let alone help anyone else." His commanding officers tried everything to get Doss to quit or wash out of the military. They assigned him the worst duties, subjected him to extra physical training, and created situations designed to break him. At one point, they even threatened him with court-martial for refusing to carry a weapon, claiming he was disobeying direct orders. The situation escalated when Doss was arrested and court-martial proceedings were initiated. He faced the possibility of prison time for his refusal to bear arms. The charges against him could have resulted in a dishonorable discharge and years of imprisonment. His future hung in the balance, and everyone expected him to either give in or give up. But then something unexpected happened. His former boss back in Virginia, who had tried to prevent Doss from being drafted because his work at a shipyard was considered essential to the war effort, wrote a letter explaining that Doss had voluntarily given up his draft deferment to serve. This testimony, combined with Doss's clear willingness to serve in combat and his genuine desire to help his fellow soldiers, led to the charges being dropped. However, the harassment didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. His fellow soldiers believed he was putting them at risk. In their minds, in combat, you needed every man to be able to fight. A medic who wouldn't even carry a pistol for self-defense was worse than useless. He was dangerous. Doss endured it all with remarkable patience. When soldiers beat him up, he didn't fight back or report them. When they mocked his faith, he continued to pray. When they made his life miserable, he responded with kindness. Slowly, grudgingly, some of his fellow soldiers began to respect his conviction, even if they didn't understand it. Off to war. After completing his training, Doss was assigned to the 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division. In 1944, his unit shipped out to the Pacific Theater, where some of the war's most brutal fighting was taking place. The Pacific Campaign was characterized by island-hopping warfare, where American forces would assault heavily fortified Japanese positions in a series of bloody battles. Doss's first combat experience came during the Battle of Guam in July 1944. The fighting was intense, with Japanese soldiers defending every inch of the island. It was here that Doss first proved his worth as a combat medic. Under heavy fire, he treated wounded soldiers, often exposing himself to danger to reach men who had fallen in exposed positions. His fellow soldiers began to see that Doss's religious convictions didn't make him a coward. In fact, his refusal to carry a weapon seemed to make him braver. He would run toward danger to help others while having no means to defend himself except his faith in God. During the Guam campaign, Doss saved numerous lives, treating wounds, administering morphine, and dragging wounded men to safety. The soldiers who had once mocked him began to change their minds. They started to see that having Doss as their medic might not be such a bad thing after all. The Philippines proving ground. The next major test came during the Battle of Leyte in the Philippines. The fighting was savage, with Japanese forces defending the island with suicidal determination. Doss repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers. On one occasion, he treated 4 men who had been wounded by a grenade, even though he was under direct machine gun fire. His reputation was growing. Soldiers who had once wanted nothing to do with him now specifically requested to be in units where Doss was the medic. They had seen his courage under fire and his unwavering commitment to saving lives. The man they had once called a coward was proving to be one of the bravest soldiers in the division. But nothing could prepare anyone for what was coming next. Okinawa, Hacksaw Ridge, the descent into hell. The Battle of Okinawa, which began on April 1, 1945, was one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific War. The Japanese had turned the island into a fortress, with the rugged terrain providing natural defensive positions. One of the most formidable of these was an escarpment known to the Americans as Hacksaw Ridge, a 400-foot vertical cliff that the Japanese had fortified with machine guns. The name Hacksaw Ridge came from the jagged, saw-toothed appearance of the cliff face. It was a natural fortress, and the Japanese had made it even more deadly with interconnected tunnels, hidden bunkers, and carefully positioned firing points that provided overlapping fields of fire. On April 29, 1945, Doss's unit, the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry, was ordered to take Hacksaw Ridge. They climbed the escarpment using cargo nets and rope ladders, a terrifying ascent under enemy fire. Once they reached the top, they found themselves in a nightmare landscape of shattered trees, shell craters, and hidden enemy positions. The fighting was immediate and brutal. Japanese soldiers emerged from tunnels and bunkers, attacking with rifles, machine guns, grenades, and even swords. The Americans fought desperately to hold the ground they had gained, but casualties mounted rapidly. Men fell all around Doss, crying out for medics. This is where Desmond Doss became a legend. One more, the prayer that saved lives. As American forces were forced to retreat from Hacksaw Ridge, leaving their wounded behind, Doss refused to leave. While his unit withdrew down the escarpment, Doss stayed on top of the ridge, alone in the darkness with the wounded and the enemy. What happened over the next hours and days defies belief. Doss began systematically rescuing wounded soldiers one by one. He would find a wounded man, treat his wounds to stabilize him, then drag or carry him to the edge of the cliff. There, he had rigged a rope and pulley system using a litter and rope. He would secure the wounded soldier, lower him down the 400-foot cliff face to safety, then go back for another. The physical demands were enormous. Many of the wounded men weighed more than Doss himself. He had to drag them across open ground, often under fire, then maneuver them to the cliff edge and lower them down. The rope burned his hands raw. His body screamed with exhaustion. Japanese soldiers were all around, hunting through the darkness. But Doss had a prayer that kept him going. After each successful rescue, he would pray, "Dear God, please help me get one more." Then he would go back into the killing zone to find another wounded soldier. One more, just one more. The prayer became a mantra, driving him forward when his body wanted to collapse, when fear threatened to overwhelm him, when every logical instinct told him to save himself. He saved one more, then one more, then one more again. Throughout the night and into the next day, Doss continued his rescue mission. He treated wounds in the darkness, using his hands to feel for injuries he couldn't see. He whispered encouragement to wounded men who thought they'd been abandoned. He dragged men who were unconscious, lowered men who were screaming in agony, and rescued men who had given up hope. The Japanese were actively hunting for him. They could hear the rope moving, could hear the sounds of the wounded being moved. They threw grenades in his direction and fired at shadows. But somehow, incredibly, Doss continued his work unharmed. The villages of Hacksaw Ridge. Over the course of approximately 12 hours, Desmond Doss single-handedly rescued 75 men from Hacksaw Ridge. Think about that number. 75 individual rescues. 75 times he found a wounded man, treated his wounds, dragged him to the cliff, and lowered him to safety. 75 times he whispered his prayer and went back for one more. The soldiers who had once mocked him as a coward now called him a miracle. Men who had survived because of him would later testify that they had seen bullets pass through his uniform without touching his skin. They saw grenades land near him and fail to explode. They witnessed him move through enemy fire that should have killed him a dozen times over. Doss himself believed that God had protected him. "I was praying the whole time," he later said. "I just kept praying, 'Lord, please help me get one more.' And he did. He helped me get one more and then one more after that. But his miraculous survival during the Hacksaw Ridge rescue was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, Doss continued to demonstrate extraordinary courage. On May 5th, he was wounded by a grenade blast that embedded 17 pieces of shrapnel in his legs and body. While waiting for help, he treated his own wounds. When medics finally arrived to evacuate him, he insisted they treat another more seriously wounded soldier first. While waiting, he was hit by a sniper's bullet that shattered his arm. Even with a shattered arm and shrapnel throughout his body, Doss took care of himself. He fashioned a splint for his arm using a rifle stock, the closest he ever came to holding a weapon. He then crawled 300 yards to an aid station, refusing to cry out in pain because he didn't want to give away the position of other soldiers. The aftermath and recognition. Desmond Doss was evacuated from Okinawa and spent the next 5.5 years in military hospitals recovering from his wounds. He underwent extensive surgery to remove shrapnel and repair his damaged arm. He contracted tuberculosis, which was common in the crowded military hospitals of that era, and had to have a lung and 5 ribs removed. By the time he was finally discharged in 1946, he had lost his physical health but none of his faith. On October 12, 1945, President Harry S. Truman presented Desmond Doss with the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration for valor. Doss became the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor, and remains one of only 3 conscientious objectors to have been so honored in American history. The citation for his Medal of Honor reads in part, "He was a company aid man when the 1st Battalion assaulted a jagged escarpment 400 feet high. As our troops gained the summit, a heavy concentration of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire crashed into them, inflicting approximately 75 casualties and driving the others back. Private First Class Doss refused to seek cover and remained in the fire-swept area with the many stricken, carrying them one by one to the edge of the escarpment and there lowering them on a rope-supported litter down the face of a cliff to friendly hands." The ceremony was emotional. President Truman, who had seen plenty of heroes during the war, was reportedly moved by Doss's story. Here was a man who had gone to war refusing to kill, had been mocked and beaten by his fellow soldiers, and had then become one of the war's greatest heroes by saving rather than taking lives. Life after war. Returning to civilian life was difficult for Doss. His wounds left him partially disabled. The tuberculosis and subsequent surgeries had weakened him significantly. He was deaf in one ear from the grenade blast and lived with chronic pain from his injuries, and the shrapnel still embedded in his body. He married his sweetheart, Dorothy Shuta, whom he had been courting before the war. They had one son together and built a quiet life in Georgia. Doss didn't seek fame or attention. He worked simple jobs, struggled with his health, and remained deeply devoted to his Seventh-day Adventist faith. For decades, Doss lived in relative obscurity. He would occasionally speak at schools or churches about his experiences, always emphasizing that God had protected him and that his story was meant to inspire faith rather than glorify war. He was humble to a fault, often uncomfortable with the attention his Medal of Honor brought him. His wife Dorothy died in 1991, which devastated him. He later remarried to Frances Dumont, who cared for him through his declining years. As he aged, his health continued to deteriorate, but his faith never wavered. Rediscovery and the movie. In the early 2000s, documentary filmmaker Hal Holbrook created The Conscientious Objector, a documentary about Doss's life. The film won several awards and brought renewed attention to his story. But it was the 2016 feature film Hacksaw Ridge, directed by Mel Gibson and starring Andrew Garfield as Doss, that truly brought his story to a worldwide audience. The film was a massive success, earning over $180 million worldwide and receiving 6 Academy Award nominations, winning 2. Millions of people who had never heard of Desmond Doss were suddenly aware of his incredible story. Sadly, Doss died on March 23, 2006, a decade before the major motion picture was released. He was 87 years old. But before his death, he was aware of the film project and gave it his blessing. He hoped that his story might inspire others to have faith and to stand up for their convictions, even when doing so was difficult or unpopular. The men he saved. The most powerful testament to Desmond Doss's impact comes from the men he saved. Many of them stayed in contact with him throughout their lives, writing letters, calling on holidays, and visiting when they could. At reunions of the 77th Infantry Division, Doss was always surrounded by soldiers who wanted to thank him again for saving their lives. One soldier, Cecil Gorman, recalled, "I was lying there wounded, sure I was going to die. Then I heard someone whisper, 'You're going to be okay. I'm going to get you out of here.' It was Doss. He bandaged my wounds while bullets were flying all around us. Then he dragged me to safety. I owe him everything, my life, my children, my grandchildren. Everything." Another soldier, Captain Vernon, who had once tried to get Doss kicked out of the army, later said, "I was wrong about him. I thought he was going to be a liability. Instead, he was the bravest man I ever knew. He didn't just save lives, he changed how I thought about courage, about faith, about what it means to be a soldier." The 75 men Doss saved went on to live full lives. They married, had children and grandchildren, built careers, and contributed to their communities. It's estimated that today, thousands of people are alive because Desmond Doss saved their grandfathers or great-grandfathers on Hacksaw Ridge. Each family reunion, each birthday, each wedding in those families is a testament to what one man did over the course of one night in May 1945, the power of conviction. What makes Desmond Doss's story so powerful is not just what he did, but why and how he did it. He maintained his convictions in the face of enormous pressure, from his military superiors, from his fellow soldiers, from the enemy, and from the simple logic that suggested carrying a weapon in combat was necessary for survival. He could have compromised. He could have carried a pistol just for self-defense. He could have agreed to train with weapons even if he didn't intend to use them. He could have accepted the deferment that would have kept him out of combat entirely. Any of these compromises would have made his life easier. But Doss believed that compromising his faith would be worse than any hardship he might face for maintaining it. This kind of moral clarity and courage is rare. Most people, when faced with intense social pressure and physical danger, find ways to rationalize compromise. Doss never did. Yet his convictions didn't make him judgmental toward others. He never condemned soldiers who carried weapons or killed the enemy. He understood that they were doing what they believed was right, just as he was doing what he believed was right. He served alongside them, treated their wounds, and risked his life for them without reservation.
Thanks for watching. For more real-life stories, subscribe, leave a comment for more.